Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. The Buddha mostly spoke about the individual path to liberation. This is definitely the main theme and focus of his discourses. But there are a handful of places and some more expansion in the commentaries where the Buddha or his followers speak about human society in a more general way. So I thought it might be an interesting topic to take up is what did the Buddha teach about humans living in society? I think the first thing to bear in mind before even diving into details is that as modern people living in the 21st century in Western society, if we want to honestly understand what the Buddha was teaching in this regard and in many other regards, we have to be careful not to impose our own concepts and biases onto the original teachings, and not to fall into anachronism and cultural bias of modernism. If you do want to start with suppositions of modern categories, it occurred to me when thinking about these various texts that one could cherry pick and support almost any modern political bias in the texts. There is, for example, the Kuttadanta Sutta, which is a story of a past life of the Buddha where he was the wise counselor of foolish king. And at that time there were rebellions and banditry. And the king wanted to take a tough kind of no-nonsense approach, go in there with the army, capture as many of this they could and hang him and make an example. And the Buddha said that, or the Bodhisatta, the wise counselor, he said that would only work in the short term. What we need to do is pacify that province. Is we need to find out who amongst the people there would like to go into farming, and then we should grant them land and seed. And who wants to go into trade, then we should loan them capital. And who wants to work, then we should find them work in the royal service. So basically, in modern terms, a state interventionist policy, kind of a social democratic idea. The state gets in and intervenes in the economy and makes everything work. On the other hand, we have the advice of the Vajrayans, which ends up being very conservative in tone. The Vajrayans were a republic in the north of India that the Buddha advised how their republic could be sound and healthy and persist a long time, and he gave various principles that they should follow. They should meet frequently and meet in harmony, and so forth. One of the principles was that they should not alter those laws and traditions which have been passed down from their forefathers, but keep the old traditions. And another was they should honor and revere the national shrines, both at home and abroad. So, honoring the symbols and rituals of the nation. And they should respect the women folk and not take wives by force. They should respect the elders and listen to their advice. And they should support and respect the holy men that live in the kingdom or in the republic. So this has a very, in modern terms, again, we would call it a conservative kind of, or a traditionalist, perhaps more specific, approach. Respecting the the shrines, respecting the symbols, like in modern terms, be like the flag or the national anthem, and not changing laws and traditions that have been passed down from the forefathers. So there's a couple of examples where very, very explicit, clear, we might say political ideas are expressed by the Buddha, and if you take them all together, they're hard to pin down in any modern terms. I don't think we should really do that. It's anachronistic. We're talking in terms of a totally different society. A lot of the discussion about social and political matters in the Buddhist text revolves around the idea of kingship. At the time of the Buddha, India was mostly governed by monarchies. There were a few republics, but that seems to have been the older form of government, and it was being made obsolete by larger centralized monarchies. And so a lot of the discussion is around the institution of kingship. The origin of kingship is a significant question that comes up in the Ajahn Sutta. And it's interesting that there's a debate between the Buddha and Brahmins about the origin of kingship amongst humankind, and it parallels debates that we know from European history that were current in, say, the 17th century, between the idea that kingship was a divine institution and the other that it was in John Locke's terms, a social contract. It was a form of government that was devised by human beings for purely practical ends. The Brahmins claimed that, and the idea of kingship for them is tied up with the concept of a caste system, that at the creation of the world there was an original sacrifice of the being Purusa, and he was divided up, and different parts became different things. Mountains, his bones became the mountains, and so blood became the rivers, and so forth. And Brahman, the god Brahma, created different castes of mankind from different parts of his own body. The Brahmins sprang from his forehead, and the Kshatriyas from his chest, and the Vaisyas, the merchant class, came from his belly, and the Sudras, or laborers, came from his feet. The king is the highest of the Kshatriyas. So there was this original idea that a divine being, a god, had ordained order of society, and so it's unimpeachable. It springs from a transcendental source. The Buddha denied this, and the Ajahn Sutta has multiple levels of meaning and reasons that different parts of it have, but there's one section that deals with the origins of the caste system and the origins of kingship. And it begins with the idea that human beings in very early times, originally we were like Brahma gods, and we slowly devolved. And there was a phase as we became fully human, we devolved to the point of being fully human, and our food source devolved along with us. And at one point there was rice growing that was, by modern terms, we would consider like magical rice, that it grew on the plant already like cooked white rice. You just go out and gather it, and it's ready to eat. It just comes right off the plant, ready to eat. And human beings got lazy. Some of them got lazy and said, why should we go out and gather rice every day for our meal? Let's gather whole potfuls and store them, and then we only have to go out once a week or so. And when they did that, that put too much stress on the plants, and they devolved into the modern kind of rice that requires a lot of work. And rice cultivation is very labor intensive. So this was kind of the beginning of the end of primitive paradise. And then people had to grow their own rice and maintain fields. And some individuals turned to banditry and stealing rice from other people's fields. So they had to protect their fields. And this was the institution of private property. Because before that, there was no private property. You just wander and take rice. And now you had fields. So this is, historically, we could see that's the beginning of agriculture. From hunter and gathering to agriculture. That once agriculture comes in, you've invested labor into this crop. So you have a definite concept, this is mine. And so private property is invented. But once you have private property, you get theft. And some people don't respect the property of others and they steal. And this leads to violence because people then started defending their rice fields and fighting and other people raiding and, by violence stealing from others. So they got together and decided, we can't put up with this situation. Why don't we choose one amongst us to be the ruler and wield the stick, the danda. The word danda in Pali is literally, it means stick. It's also used metaphorically as punishment and as power. And it's the origin of the symbology of the state. In Canada, when Parliament is in session, they have the royal mace has to be on the table. That's the danda. That's the stick. That's the state has the power to whack you with the stick if you don't do what you're told. In ancient Rome, they had the fasces, a bundle of rods with a axe head in it. It all comes back to that same idea. The danda, the stick, is the power of the state. And in this way, it was seen as creating the king was sort of a necessary evil. Now, you've got to keep these thieves and bandits in line somehow. We were happier when we didn't need to have somebody wielding a stick, but now we're going to have to do it. So they chose one among them, the one who is strongest, most able, and so on. There's a whole list of adjectives, and it's kind of funny in that several of the adjectives just mean good looking. We choose the most handsome, the most good looking. So they chose some guy to be the king. And probably still how elections happen a lot of times. Is the most good looking. And he was called Mahasamata, the great elect. And then from him, kingship became hereditary. And the Buddha's royal family that he was a member of, the Sakyans, they claimed descent from Mahasamata. So there was this idea of kingship being created as a social invention by human beings themselves, as a means and end to preserving order in a society that had private property and potential of violence. But then the practical reality of kingship by the Buddhist time becomes problematic. The personality of the king, of course, has a great bearing on whether the state is well ruled or not. Some of the kings were aggressive or tyrannical, others were generous and respectful of the rule of law. But as a variable kind of institution, is recognized as all human things are, as being flawed. And there is a sense throughout that kingship remains a necessary evil. There's the passage where the Buddha is talking about the dangers of sense desire and accumulation of wealth. And he says, if one accumulates much wealth, then one has much trouble. One has always anxiety about whether this wealth will be lost to fire, to flood. And there's a list of things that can happen to your wealth. And one of them is it may be carried off by greedy relatives or kings. So the idea of taxation. I don't get the impression that ancient India was, by ancient standards, was oppressed with very heavy taxes. Some ancient empires were, like I think the Assyrians maybe were a very bad case, where tax was over 50% of people's wealth, and some of these empires, they seem to regard the common folk as just a resource to be milked for the benefit of the rulers. But India seems to have been pretty prosperous in the Buddhist time and for a long time thereafter. But there was still the idea that that kings could arbitrarily take your possessions away. And this was definitely seen as a problem. There are a couple of places where there is some mention of an ideal kingship. And one of them is the Buddha is contemplating the question in his own mind, is it possible for a king to rule righteously in the world without resort to violence and extortion? And Mara hears the thought in his mind and tells the Buddha, why don't you set the example? With your power, you could turn the Himalaya mountains into gold and use the wealth to benefit the people and rule righteously. And the Buddha said, I know you, Mara, get away. And there's one interesting thing in that. It's just a little short sutta, but there's one interesting thing in that is the question is never answered. It's not said it's possible for a king to rule without force and extortion. And another interesting point is the only way that Mara can suggest that it might be possible is the use of supernormal power. Create wealth out of nothing, so you don't have to tax anybody, right? Something that would not work in the ordinary course of things. The other example is the Chakravarti, the wheel-turning monarch. And this is set as an ideal type of ruler that arises once in a very long time, in aeons of time. A Chakravarti will arise in the world. When a great wheel appears in the sky above his palace as a sign that this king is a Chakravarti. And then he leads his fourfold army. Fourfold army are infantry, cavalry, chariots, and elephants. Leads his fourfold army out to follow the wheel. And they rise up through the sky. And it's like there's a road in the sky, and they follow behind the wheel, and they go from kingdom to kingdom. And everywhere they go, the lesser kings submit to his rule without warfare. They lay down their arms and submit to him by the sign of the wheel. And he tells them to follow the 5 precepts and sets them up as vassal kings. And again, he finances this whole deal of this world rulership by supernatural means. Part of the journey, as they fly over the great ocean, the ocean opens up like 2 walls of lapis lazuli. And the wheel and the army go down to the floor of the sea, which is now open. And the floor of the sea is covered in precious gems, which they scoop up and take away and use that to finance the kingdom. So the only way rulership can happen without any kind of extortion is by supernatural means. I guess they hadn't invented deficit financing. So these are kind of unattainable, unreachable in ordinary human terms. The one example in Indian history who's often considered to be the most closest to the ideal is King Ahsoka, who ruled a couple of centuries after the Buddha. And he ruled virtually the whole of India. And this was unprecedented. He was the first one to have united India under his control. And the history says that he began as a conquering monarch, fighting wars and after one big battle, he saw all the dead on the battlefield, and his heart was moved to compassion and remorse, and he renounced violence. And he left whatever lands he had not conquered, he left them alone. But he now ruled about 90% of India, and converted to Buddhism and tried to rule by Buddhist principles. And as far as possible to practice ahimsa, non-harming. And we don't really know too much historical detail about how well it worked. We do have his pillar edicts that were proclamations he made and posted them on pillars all around the kingdom that were claiming principles of his rule. And among them, for example, he abolished capital punishment. He even tried to protect birds and animals. He didn't abolish completely the slaughter of animals, but he limited it to a minimum. And there are also legendary stories about him and his support of the Buddhist Sangha and his great generosity. And it seems like during his reign, this is also known, that he sent missionaries all over the place to spread Buddhism outside of India. And some of them reached the Hellenistic kingdoms in the West. And the one that was most successful was the mission to Sri Lanka, which established Buddhism in Sri Lanka, which is how the Theravada tradition actually was established and survived in Sri Lanka. The idea of a good monarch, like Ahsoka, is that they follow the principles of Dhamma. And there is a list of 10 Rajadhammas, kingly virtues, that a righteous monarch ought to follow. And when a Chakrawati, a wheel-turning monarch, keeps the Rajadhammas, then the wheel remains for him. But if he breaks the Rajadhammas, departs from them, then he loses his authority. And ordinary earthly kings are admonished to try and live up to these ideals. And they include non-harming, non-enmity, non-anger, generosity, liberality, patience, kindness. So Buddhist virtues. The list overlaps a lot with the 10 paramis. One who follows these Rajadhammas is called a righteous king. In Pali is Dhammika, a Dhamma king. And the only one living king in the Buddhist time who gets given this title by the Buddha is King Bimbisara of Magadha, who was killed by his son Ajatasattu. Bimbisara is the only one he called a righteous king. So it seems to have been, as we could expect, it was relatively rare for an actual monarch to follow these. But this concept of the Rajadhammas raises what I think is really the most important point about the Buddhist view of humans living in society, is that the emphasis is on duty. The king is righteous if he keeps his duties as a king. And there's a sutta, the Sagala Sutta, the advice to lay people, that deals with human relationships as mutual and reciprocal. It's a very interesting sutta to study. The Buddha is speaking to one individual man, so he's kind of taking him as the central point, this man as a central point, and he has different kinds of relationships. He has parents, so he has a relationship of son and parent. He has children, so he's parent and children. He has a wife, so husband and wife. And he's an employer. He's got a business, so he has a workman and employer. And he supports holy men, so it's like the layman and the samana. And in each of these is like pairwise relations. The Buddha says how this can work harmoniously. Each individual, as a social actor in that relationship, has a set of duties to fulfill. A husband has duties towards his wife, and the wife has duties towards her husband. The employer has duties towards his workmen, and the workmen have duties towards the employer. And if all these duties are fulfilled, then everything is harmonious and everything works smoothly. And this is parallel to the idea of the Rajadhammas, that the king has these duties to fulfill. And when the Buddha talked in the Aganya Sutta about the castes, when he got into the castes, his kind of idea was that he was putting across was that in ancient times, the caste system, in primordial times, the caste system was practical invention based on occupations, and it worked well while people kept to their duties. The Brahmins had the duty to study and to be the holy men, and by the Buddha's time, they had degenerated into kind of a greedy ritualist thing. And the Kachins were supposed to be the protectors, not supposed to be the oppressors. And everyone had duties that they were supposed to fulfill. And if all these duties are fulfilled by each individual, then everything works harmoniously. This is quite a different way of thinking from a modern idea of personal rights. You have the idea that comes in a lot of modern discourses is all around, centered about what a person's rights are, which is what you're allowed to do, what you're guaranteed allowance to do. This doesn't come up at all in the Buddhist discourse. There's no idea of that. The idea is you have responsibilities and duties to fulfill, and depending on your particular niche in society, they're going to be different. For example, the Buddha's attitude toward caste. The caste system is very central to society in India. And we see that the Buddha was criticized by the Brahmins for disregarding caste, in that he let anyone into the order, even untouchables. Anyone could ordain, and they lost their caste distinctions. They were all just samanas now. But this doesn't mean that the Buddha was trying to change or reform the caste system in the broader society. He never approached that. He did say, like in the Aganya Sutta, that it had become corrupted from its original intention, but he did accept that people had differentiated places and roles in society. In several places, he gets into disputes with Brahmins, and one of the points of contention is the Brahmins claimed they were the highest caste, and the Buddha sometimes approached that by showing the provisional and arbitrary nature of the caste system, saying it's not divinely ordained, it's a practical thing. And in other times he approached it by denying that the Brahmins are the highest caste and claiming that the Katyans are actually the highest caste. The warriors actually outrank the Brahmins. And he could argue from arcane points of caste rules to prove this. So he doesn't seem to have been a social reformer of any kind. He wasn't interested in doing away with the existing social order, but only encouraging people to reform themselves and to live according to their position in society, with their emphasis on fulfilling their duties and responsibilities. And when he established the Sangha for bhikkhus, then he had an opportunity to create a microcosm, his own kind of ideal society. The order within the Sangha has, from an institutional perspective, it has a number of interesting features. One is that it's hierarchical, based strictly on seniority. And I've always thought this was a brilliant understanding of human nature shown in many of the provisions of the Sangha, that with human beings, it's impossible to create a society that's not hierarchical. If you try and create a totally egalitarian society, there's going to be power struggles, someone trying to rise to the top. It's human nature, just what we do. We're animals, we're primates in that sense. It's a dominance hierarchy. But it's cut short, it's made simple. You were ordained on Wednesday, then you're senior to the guy who was ordained on Thursday, and that's it. There's no dispute, there's no struggle for seniority. It's already settled from day one. Another thing is that originally the decision making in the Sangha was very communal. There was a kind of republican sort of constitution in the original Sangha. And this has been sort of eroded over time. It's become more monarchical. It's now, in Buddhist countries, usually the abbot of the monastery is the boss. And if you don't like it, well, you can go to another monastery. That's just the way it works. But the original form was decisions were taken more in a communal basis. And the appointed officers of the Sangha, things like the store monk and the work monk, the advice was you should look for someone who will not make decisions based on greed, anger, confusion, or fear. If someone is making decisions based on those, they're not fit to be an officer of the Sangha. So I've always thought that was one of the principles in the constitution of the Sangha that's useful as a generalized into our lives, is to, when you're making a decision, to try and examine yourself to make sure it's not coming from greed, anger, confusion, or fear. If you want to make a sound decision. Another totally different picture of an ideal society is Uttura Kuru. And this is kind of interesting, and as I said at the beginning, you could cherry pick text to support almost any kind of modern position, and Uttura Kuru ends up being kind of primitive communism. Uttura Kuru is the island north of Mount Sinaru. So it's unreachable by ordinary means. So it's this mythical place. And it's not described in any detail in the oldest text, but there's a long description in the sub-commentary describing life in Uttura Kuru. So this is something that was written probably hundreds of years after the Buddhist time. And the Uttura Kuru people live on this island, and the trees provide everything they need. Like, things grow on trees, clothes, food, and it's everything you need you just pluck from a tree. And nobody has any sense of me or mine, of personal possession. And he gives an example. If you go swimming, and people there like to swim in the river, you take your clothes off and jump in the river and swim around, and when you're done, you crawl out of the river someplace else and pick up the nearest bundle of clothes and put them on and carry on your way. And no one thinks anything wrong with that. And when you want to rest for the night, the trees will form a little bower for you to sleep in. And nobody has a husband or wife. That human beings there once a month, it's like they go into heat. They have sexual desire once a month only. Then they pair off for the night, and then when it's done, they just carry on their way and forget about it. And when the women have a baby, they give birth by the side of the road, and they make a little nest for the baby and put it in the nest and carry on, just leave it. And any passers-by sticks their finger in the baby's mouth and milk comes out of their finger and feeds the baby. So this is a kind of the imagination of people hundreds of years after the Buddha time, creating what they thought was an idyllic place. Yeah? We also notice in this that the only way any of these idyllic places work is by some kind of magical factor in the economy, like everything growing on trees. It's the only way that makes it work. So we have all these various strains in the Buddhist teachings. The one point I think that goes back directly to the Buddha that we can see clearly is this idea of people fulfilling their responsibilities and their duties, and this is the way to social harmony and well-being.
Sadhu, sadhu,